What's up, metalheads? Welcome to the Scrap Metal Podcast, the show for the misfits who've been listening to the same music since high school. I'm your host, John von Frankenstein, and joining me today is my metal thrashing mad co-host, Chris. Chris, I gotta ask you, man, how you feeling?
I gotta say, I'm feeling a little underrepresented.
Underrepresented? Oh no. I think that you should write to your local official. That's probably the best course of action. Chris, does this feeling of underrepresentation have anything to do with how you're keeping your heavy metal street cred?
You know, it might have something to do with my heavy metal street cred, and I know what everyone is thinking. Oh great, the straight white guy thinks he's feeling underrepresented. Trust me, I'm going somewhere with this. So, like so many companies, it'll be over by the time this episode comes out. So many companies are taking part in the corporate pandering during Pride Month. Right. And my job is not excluded from that list of companies. So I've gotten a lot of emails about what they're doing for Pride and, you know, all the great things they're doing. And one of the emails I recently got was about a Spotify playlist they put together that is meant to represent Pride and good times, summertime vibes. And okay. I guess some of the people that are like part of Pride throughout, you know, the country and throughout the company helped put together the playlist. So unsurprisingly, the playlist had a lot of Madonna and Lady Gaga and Katy Perry. I think there was a couple Billie Eilish songs on there, some Taylor Swift songs on there. But I gotta say, as a metalhead, I felt underrepresented because there was no Judas Priest on this playlist. I feel like a song like Living After Midnight is a great summertime vibes. You know, I think it absolutely belongs on a Pride playlist. And I was very disappointed that there was no Judas Priest on this playlist. There wasn't any Queen either. But there was...
What the fuck?
There was, like, Freddie Mercury solo stuff. I think...
okay.
I forget which song it was. So that was a little disappointing. But yeah, I was like, they should have asked me, the straight white guy, because we're experts on everything, what songs should have been included. And I was disappointed there was no Judas Priest on the Pride playlist.
That is, well, first of all, I have to say, Chris, I am so happy that you took that where you did, because I got a little worried for a second. And yeah, like, I mean, the one song, like, I know if my company was to come up with a Pride playlist, I would just want to make sure that I hear, like, if you gave me a chance, I will take it. I love that fucking song. Makes me want to dance. But yeah, Living After Midnight. I was like, there was a meme recently that said something along the lines of like, you know, like, oh, something about being gay in metal, and how like people would be like really judgmental and be like, no, that's gay, and like using it in a derogatory way. And then they're like, Rob Halford of Judas Priest sings a song about like having gay sex, and they're like, fuck yeah, this is so metal. He truly bamboozled everyone, and I love that. It's like, you know, anyone out there that was hateful, like suddenly was like, oh shit, okay, I guess we didn't realize that. Yeah. That's a lot of fun. I'm really glad that you know, they were taking the steps to properly represent everyone and fighting the good fight by making a fucking playlist. Oh my god. Do you know, I gotta ask you this. Do you know if Judas Priest ever came out with like a self-titled album, or are they like just whatever titles they came up with? I know we had done our head-to-head with Priest versus Maiden, but I can't remember that far back, unfortunately.
You know, I was trying to remember the same thing, and I double-checked. I do not believe Judas Priest has ever come out with a self-titled, because I knew Iron Maiden did. You know, Iron Maiden in our head-to-head, Iron Maiden had their self-titled, but I don't think Judas Priest did. I know their first album was something like Sin After Sin or something. It was more of like I was going through the albums and being like, hey, when did the cool logo show up? You know?
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, self-titled albums are such a staple of the metal and rock world. You know, it's like sometimes it could be that very first album, and other times bands will like mix it up and spice things up a little bit, and it'll be like the 6th album in their discography.
Yeah.
Suddenly they go with a self-titled album. And that's something that's just so important in the metal community that we wanted to celebrate this with you guys today. Chris came up with the great idea of discussing self-titled albums, so that's what we're diving into today. Some of our favorites, some new ones that I was able to find throughout my research, and what makes these albums so great. Chris, are you excited to talk about self-titled albums?
I am so excited to have this conversation about self-titled albums. Like you said, I came up with this idea while I was racking my brain trying to remember a different really good idea I had. And then I was like, was it self-titled albums? No, but that's actually a really good idea. And yeah, like you're saying, the self-titled album is such an important part of, I feel like, music, and especially in rock music, and from a time when you would sit down and listen to an entire album, it's great to have that just self-titled album, because then there's no mistaking the band or the song names or the album titles. If someone tells you, hey, buy this band's album,
right,
all you got to do is go into the store, when people used to do that, and pick up the album that has the name on it, and there's no mistaking it for which is the band name, which is the album name. And there's been a lot of good self-titled albums, like you're saying. Sometimes they're debut albums, which are phenomenal. Sometimes a band decides late in their career, hey, I think it's time we release a self-titled album.
Yeah.
Some of those albums are good, some of them maybe not. But, you know, it's sometimes it almost feels like every band should at some point release a self-titled album. So
yeah,
I'm just very excited to talk about all these different self-titled albums today.
So I love the variety that we get with self-titled albums, because like you said, sometimes it can be that very first one, and other times, you know, it just pops up in the middle of a discography. But going into this, what I wanted to do for myself was to try and focus on albums that I hadn't really listened to before, or finding bands with self-titled albums and then giving them a shot. So for the most part, a lot of my list this episode comes down to bands that I was listening to either the very first time or my first time listening to those albums, because I felt like the ones that jumped out right off the bat for me were Slipknot's self-titled debut, Boston 1, you know, and like the Black Album. So I didn't want to default to those, you know. It's like they might come up throughout the episode, but I definitely wanted to try and listen to some new stuff as well, and give our listeners some new stuff to listen to. But Chris, this was your idea. Why don't you do the honors? Give us the very first self-titled album you want to discuss.
So I absolutely did not take into consideration, hey, let me find something different. And I went straight to the first self-titled album I thought about, Black Sabbath.
Okay, I didn't even think of that one.
Released
How did I miss that?
Released in 1970 on Friday the 13th, Black Sabbath, their self-titled album, Black Sabbath, with the first title track, Black Sabbath. Super original. But like, this introduced the world.
That concept is going to come up again, I promise you.
This introduced the world to heavy metal. And it's... because I have to bring her up all the time. The charismatic voice not too long ago reacted to Black Sabbath. And it was fun seeing her react to it, because what's always fun about watching her reactions and a lot of people's reactions to music is that, for me, I love the song Black Sabbath, and I've listened to it a bunch. And I also know that in the past 50 years, we've gotten a lot of louder and heavier heavy metal. Right. But it's always so fun to see someone else, and it makes me appreciate even more what Black Sabbath was doing in 1970. You know, I think the idea that, you know, I think about bands that use clips from movies to start a song or an album.
Yep.
Slayer using the sounds of rain and raining blood. You've got Black Sabbath starting with the sound of rain and church bells. And then that first chord just comes in and hits you right in the face. And even though he's just playing, I think it's a G on a standard tuning guitar, so it's not down tuned yet. They're not doing anything that you associate with being heavy, but it's just so loud and so distorted that it's like, this is fucking scary. And then you've got that what they call the devil's tritone that makes you feel even more scared. So throughout the 60s up until this time, rock music is what it is. And then when someone's like, oh yeah, the new rock band Black Sabbath, and what you hear is the sound of rain, church bells, and then these fucking scary ass notes, and Ozzy talking about a fucking shape in black chasing him, and like Satan or Lucifer or whatever it is. Like it's so cool that this is how the world was introduced to heavy metal. So I kind of felt like I couldn't not talk about this album. Obviously, on this album, you also have one of my all-time favorite Black Sabbath songs, The Wizard. I fucking love that song.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely love that song. The fucking harmonica and everything.
I can't believe they got Billy Joel to play the harmonica on that song. It was great.
And then on the album, you also have NIB, which is a classic Black Sabbath song. So, yeah, I kind of was like, okay, I don't want to go right for like, okay, these are the bands. Obviously, me and John could have a lot to talk about. But at the same time, I'm like, if you're talking about self-titled albums, how do you not talk about Black Sabbath?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Especially considering that this is like, for many people, they consider it the starting point of heavy metal. The birth of heavy metal is just that needle drop with the rain and the bells, and then that first chord. And like you said, this was, you have to put yourself in the mindset of someone hearing something this heavy for the very first time. By today's standards, you know, it's not heavy. It's not a down-tuned polyrhythmic breakdown, you know, but comparatively, it was heavier than anything else that was going on at the time within the mainstream now, you know, not so much back then, but still. And yeah, the fact that like they took inspiration like from a horror movie and that they were using the tritone in the intro in that riff, you know, and it's still, even though they weren't down tuned yet, like you mentioned, it still had that heaviness to it. And like, this is something like you've never experienced before. And I love the fact that in songs like The Wizard, in NIB, like Evil Woman, you've got like, you have the influences of the blues still coming through, and like Bill Ward, who I was clearly trying to channel today, coming in with like his blues and jazz drumming, where like you think about that these guys were not influenced by heavy metal drummers or heavy metal musicians before them. They were influenced by the big band and swing and blues and things like that. That's the influences that they were bringing into this. So yeah, in the same respect of how I was like, no, I don't want to bring up the very obvious albums, I'm glad that you brought this one up because it really is like the self-titled album of self-titled albums. And like I promised, the concept of being Black Sabbath off of the album Black Sabbath by the band Black Sabbath, I wanted to bring up, because this video cracks me up every time I see it, God's Hate by the band God's Hate, featuring the song God's Hate. Now, I had heard of God's Hate because of the video of them like calling out this song. So I wanted to now take the opportunity to go back and listen to the album, and, you know, just listen to it from front to back. And another kind of weird similarity between them and Black Sabbath, they do have at the start of every song, it starts off with some sort of movie clip. For their song Be Harder, it starts out with Rorschach from Watchmen. Oh, yeah. You know, violent lives being ended violently, something like that. And it's just like, I also love the concept of a song called Be Harder. It's like, stop being a fucking bitch is pretty much what the song is. It's great. It's an awesome song. Of course, you've got the self-titled track, God's Hate. And then the song Finish the Job as well, which is like really, it's super hard hitting. They're like a hardcore band with some like older thrash kind of influences. It's not so much along the lines of stuff like Knock Loose or Kubla Khan, like what's really popular now. It's kind of harkening back to like earlier hardcore, Sick of It All, Agnostic Front, like those types of riffs. So it's a really cool feel to it. And their lead singer is a professional wrestler. I had no clue that was the case, but it makes sense. This dude is huge. Yeah, I really like this album. Those are just some of the standout tracks to me. But it's a good listen all the way through. It has that really fun, like, two-step feel throughout a lot of the album. And the riffs are really, really great. And I love, introing something as like, yeah, this is the song God's Hate off of the album God's Hate. By the band God's Hate. Have you seen that video before? I might have shared that with you before.
Maybe. I'm not sure if I've seen it. It sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah, it's just like the reaction of the audience and like the band kind of cracking up about it themselves.
Yeah,
where it's like, yeah, that's we're gonna hit you with the trifecta here. But yeah, I really like their feel. They've got 2 albums and I think a couple EPs or a couple singles that are out there. But this is the one that I wanted to go with, just off of that cool little trifecta there. Chris, what's the next band that you want to mention with a really cool self-titled album?
So I'm going to continue being super basic, and I'm going to talk about Kiss.
Okay.
And their self-titled debut in 1974. Yeah,
we balance each other.
I'll be honest, I thought you were going to go day aside, day aside, day aside. So that's where I thought you were going. But yeah, I feel like we have talked so much about our love of Kiss. First concert I ever went to was Kiss. Again, similar to Black Sabbath, I kind of felt like, how do I not talk about Kiss and their self-titled album? Right. You've got classic songs on there like Strutter, like Deuce, Black Diamond, 100,000 Years. Like there's some really good songs off of this album. It's a classic album, and it's... I love Kiss, and I'm going to talk about them whenever I can, and it's that iconic album cover of the 4 faces on the cover. We've talked about how much of an influence it was on Dimebag and how those 4 faces are on Dimebag's guitar. And yeah, it's an iconic album cover of an iconic band, and there's some great songs on here, and I think it's also, you can't talk about Kiss without talking about how silly it kind of is. Like, they do not sound the way they look, and I think that's always so fun too, is like you hear a song like Strutter or Deuce and you're like, wait, the dude's like, that guy looks like a demon. And this is the music that they're playing, but like it was all just part of being that larger than life rock star look.
Yeah.
And it was so good. It gave us such a great self-titled debut, another self-titled debut. And it's just, I love Kiss. And I wanted to make sure I brought up this album.
Dude, you're so right about how the larger than life personality, like, that's something that I think is largely missing from the world of rock and metal nowadays. You do have a couple bands who use like the theatrics, but Kiss had a deeper level of it, obviously because Gene Simmons was trying to market everything as much as he possibly could, which that's obvious. That's a valid approach, but it lent itself to them building themselves up as like never being unmasked, which like Slipknot had that in the early days, and I miss that. I miss the what's the word that I'm looking for? Not enigma. What is the word that I'm looking for?
Mystique?
I miss the Rebecca Romaine Stamos mystique around Kiss before we ever saw them, without makeup, and the way that Slipknot adopted that too. And just that like larger than life, where every single one of them had their own personality reflected through the makeup. And you don't see that with a ton of bands nowadays. You've got guys like Avatar who are super theatrical. You have guys like Sleep Token. You have Ghost, who, like, I think Ghost's probably the closest to get us back to that, where it's like, this is all lore based and it's embracing the cheesiness of the over the top rock star and that personality, and being able to be separated from the people behind the masks and just having it be these characters that are out front, which Kiss portrayed themselves as basically comic book characters. Yeah. So I love that about them, especially as a kid. You see that album cover and it's like like you said, so influential to the point where Dimebag had that on one of his guitars on like the Dean from Hell.
Yeah.
And that it sticks with you. It sticks with you so much that like these dudes in glam corpse paint are now playing a song like Strutter.
Yeah, it's great, like you're saying, especially as a kid, you know, like my dad is introducing me to their music and I am pretending that I am Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley as I'm listening to songs. We would go to parties and I would keep the inflatable guitars and I would be slamming the inflatable guitar like I was Paul Stanley smashing his guitar at the end of a show. And yeah, it's just that whole, you know, larger than life. And obviously a lot of things that we associate with Kiss, you know, it grew as the band grew. You know, we've talked about how early on it was these pretty cheap homemade costumes that they were wearing. But as time went on and they became more popular and the stage show gets bigger and the costumes get better and more intricate and more interesting. And like you're saying, it just kind of, when you're a kid, it's so cool to look at. And it is interesting how Ghost does kind of seem like the only band that's coming close to doing that. And I think another big part of that is just the technology in the world we live in, you know, with social media and things like that. I feel like similar to, you know, you mentioned a professional wrestler lead singer. I feel like you see some of that in professional wrestling as well, where there was a time in the 80s where people legitimately hated Ric Flair and thought he was the worst person on the planet because they didn't necessarily realize that what they're watching isn't actually a physical competition. It's a performance.
Yeah.
You know, Ric Flair knows whether or not he's winning that match, you know, but the fans would get so mad, and that's why you were able to get away with a dude from Detroit pretending he was from India and no one knew any better. You could you could get away with being, you know, even like in the 90s when you have a character like Kane who you're claiming is burned over 80% of his body and can't even speak because his brother set their funeral home on fire when they were kids. Like, it's, you can believe that even though a few months before he made his debut, that same wrestler was wrestling as a dentist. Like it's, you could almost believe it. And it was easier to believe that. You can't do that anymore because I feel like so many, as people, we want social media because everyone's on social media. And so as professional wrestlers, it has gone from being those over-the-top characters to just being an over-the-top version of yourself, more or less. I think a lot of bands fall into that as well. And that's why it's always so entertaining when you see someone like Abbott from Immortal who has the corpse paint and looks like such a fucking over-the-top character, and you see him being a complete goofball. So it's funny to see that, and while it's entertaining in some respects, it also kind of makes you miss that time of like, no, I don't know what Gene Simmons looks like without his makeup
where you didn't
and out
have
of
the
costume.
access.
I don't have the access to that. Now it's Gene Simmons has fucking reality TV shows following him around.
I would love to see a reality TV show for the next band I'm going to bring up, actually, because I feel like that would be fucking interesting. So as much as I love Kiss and I love, all the craziness of the corpse paint and stuff like that, I also love death metal. And, you know, sometimes you've got like the death metal that's just so extreme and so technical and has all of the super guttural, nearly unintelligible vocals. And I had never given the band Cryptopsy a proper listen. And so in my search, I found the album Cryptopsy by the band Cryptopsy, and holy shit. Like, this is now a newfound, I have like 6 songs of theirs that I added to my like metal playlist that usually I add a bunch of stuff that comes off of the podcast. But this album is great. And I just like, I knew the name. I just knew that I'd never listened to them before, not out of anything other than just not knowing where to start, maybe. But I'm really glad that I started with this album, and now I'm excited to kind of go back further in their discography, because this album I think is fairly recent, maybe like 2016, 2017, something like that. It wasn't, compared to their other albums, but Their song Shag Harbor Visitors, that's really fucking great. Super, super technical. Starts out with like a cool, like ominous pad, like keyboard type sound. And then the guitars come in and it's just like ripping through. And their vocalists, like, I wish I could sound like this. Holy shit, just like fucking Cookie Monster vocals, like added to another level where like I was pulling up the lyrics because this is one of those bands that I could imagine people would listen to. People outside of the metal world would listen to and be like, how can you listen to this? You can't understand what he's saying. And then I'm reading through the lyrics and it's like really deep, like very thought out lyrics. And I'm like, holy shit. Okay. I'm glad that I pulled the lyrics up because this is really cool. Now I'm invested in the story they're telling, especially on a song like, oh gosh, what's the name? Red Skinned Scapegoat. Oh my God. This is like if you took Hallowed Be Thy Name by Maiden and turned it into a death metal song. Like it's that sort of thing. A guy talking about how he's being unjustly tried for a murder he did not commit, all because of the color of his skin. And it is just phenomenal. Like the storytelling that goes on within the music and the technicality of the musicianship was just so impressive. And the song Amputated Enigma stood out to me just because I thought that was a really cool fucking song name. So I put that one on too, and I'm like, holy shit, this whole entire album is fucking great. And like I think they're a little similar in ways to a band like Cattle Decapitation. I know you're not a huge fan, but just like the technicality and like how Cattle Decap is very much like, oh, we're writing from the perspective of vegetarians or vegans, and like this is why eating meat is bad. Where like this felt like very much like we have deeper things to say. Just because you can't understand what we're saying at the surface level doesn't mean that it's not important. And I love that about death metal because we can definitely get into those realms where it's like deeper things to have to say, but they're wrapped up with this intensity and this like very, for someone on the outside it can be like a really scary sound, you know what I mean? But it creates that appeal to say like, no, we've got important stuff to say. If you just dive a little bit deeper and don't go just surface level, now you can start to get into some of that stuff. I love that about death metal. I love that about metal in general, that it's like you get to surprise people. And we've told the story about Dee Snider like coming out, in the court case against the parental group, and like, unfolding his speech and like trying to iron it out on the edge of the desk and stuff. Like I love when metal can shock people like that, because it is a genre that will span the scope of, or the spectrum of like good time, fun, pizza thrash type of stuff, to like very in-depth and important conversations to be having. We mentioned him at the beginning of the episode, Rob Halford coming out and, having such an influence on the metal world, and creating the look of heavy metal, and no one, everybody was none the wiser that this is like the leather daddy look that they are now imitating. So I love when metal can surprise us like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. That's always great. And like you're saying, it's always great when you have examples you can cite when someone is like, oh, it's just music about the devil. It's like, no, it's not.
It can be.
It can be. And those songs are really fucking good.
Yeah.
But we're also able to write songs that are about important topics, and we're able to write about things that are personal to us. And I always love that about heavy music and its ability to present something that might be very profound or very wholesome in like the most scary and aggressive way possible. And I always find that interesting, or taking an approach. Like I often think about the song Fade to Black by Metallica, and how that's a song about struggling and ultimately deciding to commit suicide. And that's a great song. And when you think about a band like Metallica, you think of, either thrash metal or, the most popular thrash metal band in the world. But when you are able to show a song like that that's like, no, this has a very personal feeling about it, and this is actually a really sad song if you read the lyrics and try and listen to what's being said in this song. So it's always really cool whenever you find a band or a song that is taking a very aggressive approach, but singing about something that's very profound or very personal to the band.
Yeah. Yeah. Chris, what's the next album that you want to hit us with?
So I'm just going to hit the basic bitch trifecta here. I'm going to talk about Boston 1.
All right.
So
I hit the nail on the head.
We have on so many occasions, and I'm going to make the point again later, Boston 1 might as well be a greatest hits.
Yeah.
Like every
100%.
track on that album is a certified banger and a classic, and I fucking love it. I will admit I got sick of the song Smokin' because it was featured in a WWE video game a few years ago. And WWE video games will put like 10 songs on the soundtrack.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the game modes I play, or some of the stuff I like to do in the creative suite, where I'm creating new attires, creating new championship belts, creating new arenas, it just plays the soundtrack over and over again. So when I'm spending hours in menus, that means I am spending hours listening to the same 10 songs over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And so it got to a point where I'm like, I swear to fucking God, if I hear Smokin' one more goddamn time, I'm gonna fucking throw myself out a window. And like, that was around the time where I was finally like, why am I subjecting myself to this?
Yeah.
Video games have settings where you can turn the music off. So I just decided to turn the music off and listen to my own music now. Since that game is old by this point, I'm kind of over that. I do enjoy the song Smokin' again.
Yeah.
But other songs off this album, I mean, More Than a Feeling is the opening track, which is a classic. You got Peace of Mind, Foreplay and Long Time, Rock and Roll Band, Hitch a Ride, Something About You, Let Me Take You Home Tonight. These are all great songs, and I love all of them. And yeah, I had to talk about Boston because like I don't know what it was. At some point I decided, hey, let me just listen to this album, because it was like, I think what it was that I would be in the car with my dad and we'd be listening to the classic rock radio station, and a song would come on, and I'd be like, this is a really good song. Who is this? It's like, oh, it's Boston. And then a few days later, another great song would come on the radio. I'd be like, who is it? Oh, that's Boston. And that happened like 3 or 4 different times. And I'm like, Boston is consistently the best thing I hear on the radio. Let me just listen to this fucking album finally.
Yeah.
And I did. Yeah. And yeah, it is a classic. The sounds of the guitars and the they're one of the bands that I think is credited with inventing what's the phrase that I'm looking for? Like the dual guitar line. Yeah, the harmonized guitar that, them, Thin Lizzy, and then you've got a band like Iron Maiden who has made a career out of it.
Yeah.
And yeah, just, oh my God, this album is just so good, and I love it. And we've said it so many times, it might as well be a greatest hits album. But yeah, I had to make sure I talked about Boston's self-titled debut in a episode about our favorite self-titled albums.
Yeah. I mean, again, like I'm glad that you picked up the slack. Because like, I guess for me, it wasn't that I'm not saying it's wrong to refer back to like these classic self-titled albums. Just for me personally, I wanted to find new self-titled albums to listen to. Because yeah, like Kiss's debut, Black Sabbath, Boston, these are all like formative albums for me. Yeah. So I guess, we have listeners that run the gamut too, that are getting into this music for the very first time, and other people that are diehards, so in that same respect, it's like, it's good to have stuff from either end of that spectrum.
Yep.
Where it's like, these are the classics. Like, if you like
Yeah.
this stuff, then eventually you'll be able to get into the crazier, heavier, faster, whatever kind of music that we both enjoy.
Yeah.
So yeah, but Boston, I mean, the fact that they basically gave us the harmonized, like, Swedish death metal sound before there was Swedish death metal.
Yeah.
Like melodic death metal. And like Tom Schultz, we've brought him up a trillion times, inventing the Rockman amp unit.
Yeah.
Basically, like, the modeling technology that we have nowadays, that people will buy plugins and stuff so that they can record in Pro Tools. Tom Schultz was the first one to do that in this thing that looked like a little VHS tape.
Yeah.
You know, and it's incredible. And those things run for like $400 or $500 now, like probably more than that at this point, because, like, as often happens with YouTube, someone will do a demo and then everybody's like, oh shit, that's really cool. Like, people that have never heard of it before. And now the price starts to drive up, you know? So there was a funny thing that happened recently with, like, an overdrive pedal that people did not buy. It was discontinued. The company that made it is discontinued. But there was a YouTube channel that reviewed it, and now it went from being like a pedal that you could pick up for like $20-$30. Now it's like $800-$900 and upwards. And like, it's so funny when stuff like that happens. So I love when I am able to find a new band, see them perform live, and get into them after that live performance. Because I feel like seeing a band live really gives you a good idea of what this band is capable of, and what their sound is like, right? And like their energy and stuff. So like, now when I'm listening back to the album, I can imagine that same sort of energy that they had on stage while I'm listening to it. And I recently got the chance to see the band Sunami live, and these guys are awesome. Hardcore. They are from San Francisco, and they just have like such a cool sound. Their whole entire, like, the aesthetic is like bubble graffiti, like, for their logo.
Okay.
And like, everything is like these hand drawn, like, gang type feel stuff.
Yeah.
It's like dudes with like hoodies and bandanas on and like guns and stuff like that. I look so cool. Oh God. But yeah, Sunami is a ton of fun. They've got really, really good riffs. They've got really fun lyrics that you can shout along to. And they have an EP called Sunami, which is like what I'd heard first, but they have an LP titled Sunami as well, which is actually the one that I'm talking about. So it's a little bit longer of an album. But their songs Dirty Work, YSAB, which is You're Still a Bitch, are fucking great. And like, I love their feel. I love their call outs. It's so funny. On the way to see them, I played a couple songs for my wife, and I was like, you're not going to like this, but I need to show you this band. And she actually didn't mind them when we saw them live. She was like, first off, this is not who I expected to see come out on stage. And second, she's like, it's way better like seeing them live than it was on the album. But one of my favorite songs on the album is Contempt of Cop. And it's just like, you know, a standard hardcore song about like fuck police brutality. And like, there's a section in the song where it just like stops and you just get 187 on a PIG, and like getting to see the whole crowd shout that while we are standing behind an older group of people where they're like, they kind of looked at each other like, all right, that's the kind of show that we're at. I'm pretty sure that I'm almost positive that my wife and I were standing behind the parents of Eric, the bass player from Kubla Khan. So like, when that happened, I was like, oh, they're not ready for this. They're not ready for this. But they had a good time. They really had a good time. So thanks for encouraging your kids to dive into heavy metal and hardcore. But yeah, like I love that part of the song. And just like the call outs that I was talking about, where you'll have the song ends and someone will be like, yeah, motherfucker, that's fucking right, blah, 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 blah. And it's like a hype man comes out pretty much. tsunami style, bitch. Like, I love it. It's like, it's kind of corny, it's kind of cheesy, but in the right fucking way.
Yeah,
you know
definitely.
what I mean? It's like, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun, and you just have fun with it. And like, they put on a really, really good show. So yeah, I had to try to shout out Tsunami in some way, and I'm glad that they had something two self-titled albums that I could go off of. Chris, who's the next one that you want to hit us with?
We've talked a lot about, and we mentioned it, how sometimes it is self-titled debuts, but every once in a while, bands later in their career will have self-titled albums. You know,
Right. Yeah.
Metallica with the Black Album. Even I completely forgot about it until I looked up a list of self-titled albums. The Beatles' White Album was late in their career.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's a classic self-titled album that was later in their career. But sometimes bands decide, we're just going to name a bunch of albums as self-titled albums. And
I think I know where this is going.
And you'll see it with a band like Led Zeppelin. Their first 4 albums, Led Zeppelin 1 through 4. Then they started naming their albums other stuff. Lucifer recently came out with their 5th album, who we've talked about a bunch on this podcast.
Yep.
5 albums called Lucifer 1 through 5.
Yep.
I've often talked about, I believe Lucifer 2 is one of my favorites. Lucifer 4 has some good songs on it. But something that has at times made it difficult for me is that the fact that every album is just a self-titled album. So like, I've listened to a lot of Led Zeppelin, but if you tell me, oh, Zeppelin 4 is a classic, I'll be like, I'm sure it is. I have no idea which songs are on that album. Now, I'll admit I haven't spent a lot of time sitting down listening to entire Led Zeppelin albums, mostly because I've heard a lot of Led Zeppelin on the radio. That same classic rock radio station where I heard Boston, you are guaranteed to hear 2 or 3 Led Zeppelin songs every hour.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'll catch their daily Get the Lead Out, which is 30 minutes of just Led Zeppelin. So I've been exposed to a lot of Led Zeppelin music without ever sitting down and listening to an entire album.
Right.
Thankfully, there is a band who color-coded their self-titled albums for my kindergarten brain, and that's the band Weezer. Weezer has released several self-titled albums, not in a row, so not even doing like the Led Zeppelin or Lucifer thing where they're in a row. Just throughout their career, they have released multiple self-titled albums. And then it becomes, well, which one do I want to talk about? Right away, I'm not going to talk about the Teal album. That's a covers album. The covers are great, but that's not, interesting to talk about. Their Black Album, I've listened to it a couple times. Nothing really stood out to me. Similar with their White Album. I love the song Thank God for Girls, but beyond that, nothing really stood out to me. You've got the Green Album, which is a really good album. A lot of fun songs on there, a lot of catchy songs on there. But the thing that I can't stand about the Green Album is that all of the guitar solos are just the vocal melody. So it gets kind of boring.
Yeah.
Then there's the Blue Album, their self-titled album, that I would consider it and put it in that category that we put Boston 1 or Testament's The New Order. This might as well be a greatest hits album because every song on the Blue Album is great. The vast majority of Weezer fans will tell you that the Blue Album is the best or among their best. So a lot can be said about the Blue Album. But that's why I don't want to talk about the Blue Album today. Instead, I am going...
You're giving me Blue Album balls, buddy. Let's get to it.
Instead, I want to talk about their 2008 self-titled album, The Red Album.
Okay.
This album starts off with a couple great songs, Troublemaker and The Greatest Man That Ever Lived. I love these songs. Troublemaker is a catchy song. It's a fun song. The Greatest Man That Ever Lived is a cool song. They do this interesting thing where it's broken up into different sections based on different styles. So there's like the hip hop section, the heavy metal section, the Green Day section, the Beethoven section, and then the song ends with the Weezer section. You've also got their song Pork and Beans, which like the best part about that song was the music video, which made reference to all these like viral internet videos at the time. So that was really fun. You know, there's a lot of other great songs I love on there. Heart Songs is good. Everybody Get Dangerous, Dreamin'. All really good songs that I really enjoy. The closing track is The Angel and the One, which is a song I really enjoy. And it's reminiscent of Weezer's closing track on the Blue album, Only in Dreams. The second half of Only in Dreams is like a guitar solo that just like builds and gets louder and louder and louder until the end of the song. The Angel and the One as a song does that. It starts with just guitar and then builds and builds and builds. And what's cool is that since it doesn't follow like the verse, chorus format, it's just verse after verse after verse. It keeps building until you get to the end of the song. So that's really good. But as much as I've said about how much I love all of these songs, I think some of my favorite songs off of the Red album are the bonus tracks. Because you've got their cover of The Wait, which is a great song. Love that song. And then you've got a song like Pig, which is from the perspective of a pig on a farm that at the end of the song gets slaughtered, but like it's a really good song. And then you've got a song like King, which is about like basically like being the coolest, most popular guy in a club and like having to fight dudes off who think they're tougher than you. And I remember reading about the song King that the bassist, Scott Schreiner, was really excited about that song when Rivers brought it as a demo and was like, hey, we should include this on the album. And Rivers basically said, well, if you want it on the album, then you sing it because I'm not singing it. So Scott Schreiner just went and sang the song and it ended up as a bonus track. But King is also representative of a change in Weezer's style because songs like King, Troublemaker, The Greatest Man That Ever Lived, Weezer is rightfully picked on for being a very like whiny and pathetic type of singing style and lyric style and subject matter. These songs are very much, you know, being confident and being like, no, I'm the greatest man that ever lived. Like that's what these songs are basically saying. But there's a bonus track that hits you the way that only Blue Album and Pinkerton era Weezer can, and that's the bonus track Miss Sweeney. I fucking love this song. Such a good song. What's so funny about this song is that the lyrics are actually really dumb because the song is about having a crush on your coworker in an office setting. And so the lyrics are like, oh, Miss Sweeney, come into my office. I was talking to, you know, the person at the company that, the property owner, and they're, you know, if there's any problems paying the deposit, just let me know. And, oh, by the way, I'm head over heels in love with you. Like it's those are basically what the lyrics are of the song. But but I fucking love it. It's such a good song. I love it so much. And yeah, I just thought it was funny how it's like when I think of the Red album, my favorite songs are actually all the bonus tracks. But the album itself is actually really good. So I knew I had to bring up Weezer because they've had a bunch of self-titled albums. And I decided that the one I wanted to talk about today was their 2008 Red album.
I'm glad that we got to mention cattle decapitation being vegetarian and a song about a pig being slaughtered in the same exact episode. So I have an album that I want to bring up as an honorable mention because the idea behind the title is sort of to say it's a self-titled album. This is music which is taking our name, is pretty much what they're saying. That's Opus Eponymous from Ghost.
Yes.
And like I needed to have it in there as an honorable mention because it's not technically a self-titled album. The album's not titled Ghost. No. But they're saying Opus Eponymous is it's taking our name. So in a way they are saying like, yeah, it's basically just called self-titled.
Yes.
And that cracks me up. That cracks me up because it's like a cute little wink cute little wink to the audience. And like one of those things where it's like, that might annoy people that I wanted to include it on the list. But that's why I bring it up as an honorable mention.
I mean,
do you have any honor?
I wanted to mention the same exact thing. I love that the album is called self-titled work in Latin.
Oh, get out of here.
Yes.
Was that your honorable mention
literally
too?
my honorable mention. That's what I meant by they were cheating. Is that they're just, it's not called Ghost, it's called self-titled work in Latin.
Yeah.
And I love that, and I love that it shows that the Tobias Forge's idea about Ghost, the entire idea was just a like, lol, check this out. like he's like nudging someone in the ribs, like, look at what I'm gonna do.
You get it? You get it?
Get it? It's my self-titled debut called Self-Titled Album. You get it? Like it's the most ridiculous thing, but I love it. And it's like, to say nothing of how good the music is on that album, how do you not talk about Ghost and their debut album, Opus Eponymous, which is Latin for self-titled work. I love it.
Yeah. We're fucking in sync, baby. We're like this. That's fucking great. That was so good. Oh, boy. All right, Chris, now that we've got our lists out of the way and we even got a sweet little serendipitous honorable mention in there, why don't you give us your suggestion for this week?
So my suggestion this week is the Bouncing Souls and their 1997 self-titled album.
All right.
Like, a couple other bands we've mentioned, this is not their debut album, but I think it is interesting that this is a self-titled album because to me, this does kind of signal a change in some of the things that the band was doing. Before this album, they were bordering on pop punk, but very much more of a punk band. But then you get to this album and it's almost like they start leaning more towards into being, the hopeless romantic era of Bouncing Souls, where there's a little bit more emotion in some of the songs. And so you do have songs that are like, like Cracked, which is a great song, Say Anything, which are great like punk songs. You have a song like The Toilet Song, where the song is about being at a house party and asking the question, who's going to throw the toilet off the roof? So you have all of that. But then you also have songs that I feel like have a little bit more emotion behind it. A song like Single Successful Guy, where there's lines where it's like, I'm carrying all I own and my heart is heavy in my chest. And it's almost like he's trying to convince himself, like, no, I'm a single successful guy, when it's like he doesn't really feel it. It almost feels like he's just trying to convince himself of that. Similar with Holiday Cocktail Lounge, where he's saying like, hey, I know it's happy hour next door, but I kind of like where I'm sitting right now. I've got a drink. There's a band playing. I'm just going to sit here at this bar where, people come and go and they tell stories, and maybe someone else sat in this same stool and felt the same way. But, this is where I want to be right now. And then the album ends with Shark Attack, which is about the Bouncing Souls crashing at people's houses on tour and eating all of their food. And it is hilarious. Such a hilarious song. I love it. So that's why my suggestion is the Bouncing Souls and their self-titled album from 1997, The Bouncing Souls.
That's cool. I did see them on like one of the lists that I was reading through. So I'm glad that you brought that album up.
Yep.
So for my suggestion, I wanted to go with the band Chimaira and their self-titled album Chimaira. So similar to what you were just saying, this came a little bit later on in their career. And like, I always just loved the album cover itself is a chimera, like these three creatures like melded into one. It's just like the skeletons and the skulls.
Yeah.
So it's such a good album. It's like the really tight, locked in riffs between the guitars and the drums, really good, like just gnarly vocals and stuff like that. They have a really cool cover of Disposable Heroes on this album. But the album starts out with the song Nothing Remains, which is just like a really cool syncopated guitar riff. And then the drums come in and it just hits so hard. It's such a cool opener off of a self-titled album. And what I love is at the end of the song, they bring that intro riff back and the drums change the feel. The guitar stays the same and the riff stays the same, but the drums will play underneath the guitar and change the feel of the riff itself. And I love doing stuff like that. You also have the song Left for Dead. That's one of my favorites. That's such a good fucking song. Chimaira is just like one of those bands where they have a lot of really cool albums to go off of. They were kind of part of like that metalcore, or like the beginnings of metalcore, where they had a little bit more of a hardcore feel to them. And I love that, like, as their career went on, they just got better and better and more intricate. And this album is just a really, really good example of that. If you want to hear some really tight riffs, check out Chimaira's self-titled album, Chimaira. Chris, I'm going to run the idea by you now that we just call this episode the Scrap Metal Podcast. But that being said, thanks for tuning into the Scrap Metal Podcast. The time has come for us to pack up our gear, but we'll be back to rock out with you in the next episode.
Stay metal, everyone.
Good night.